So this tells quite the story. And by the same token, you had the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany after the war with Ludwig Erhard and these finance ministers for the West German government, which again, if you scratch and sniff who these people are, well, Ludwig Erhard, who later became the chancellor and who was one of the early finance ministers of West Germany, well, he worked for Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry in a very high position, as did, for that matter, Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger. So, you had all of these basically Nazi characters running this so-called economic miracle inside of Germany, but you need look no further than the fact that where's all of this wonderful money coming from? Why is this dang Deutschmark so stable? Well, it's because there's a huge cash reserve, a huge gold reserve, a huge platinum reserve that's backing all this stuff up, and it's in New York banks, and Martin Bormann is the guy sitting on top of all of this, and you can talk to West German prosecutors from that period of history, and they often went on record as saying there was something very, very peculiar in their attempts to investigate Bormann's whereabouts and presence, using their lender capabilities or the German federal government capabilities. Yeah. That they would oftentimes meet this invisible wall of resistance that they could not figure out, where is this pressure not to investigate all of this coming from? Well, I can tell you, it's coming from those Anglo-American banks, and it's coming from the Nazis in Latin America.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, that's a good point, because there's so many unanswered questions surrounding World War II and what happened there with not only the money, but everything in terms of people. And I mean, it's incredible that they, got away with it, if you will. But I also just quickly want to mention here that the meeting here that you were talking about at the Maison Rouge Hotel in Strasbourg, apparently on August 10th, 1944, where all this was discussed, has been detailed in something that is called the Red House Report. It's also the U.S. military intelligence have dubbed this report EWPA 128, in case anyone out there want to read more about this report. And it's an interesting one, because again, as you emphasize, it basically talks about the Nazis' return to power, and to work for a strong German empire again. What they would dub in one way the Fourth Reich, but through the European Union, basically.
Yes. So exactly.
That sets a little bit of the framework, obviously, as well, of what we're talking about here. But I guess this might sound like a stupid question, but what does this group need money for? In one way, if they're so incredibly wealthy in one sense, and potentially, I would say, are controlling a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes. It's almost like if they're involved in these major industries and things like that, what are they trying to finance, do you think, Joseph?
Oh, an excellent question, and let me give a rather strange answer. There was a fellow in Europe that published a book. His name was Henrik Kruger. In fact, I think he may have been Swedish. I don't know which country he was from, but I think that he was from Sweden. Right. And he published a book that was called The Great Heroin Coup, as in the drug. And he details the activities of the criminal underground in the 1970s to entirely restructure the world drug trade. Well, one of the things he also points out in that book is you have the heavy involvement of this international fascist organization in those activities to penetrate the international drug trade and use it as a source of more funds. So back to your question, what do they need all of this money for?
Yeah.
Now, in my opinion, Henrik, if you read the implications of my book, The Nazi International, carefully and closely, what you have going on in Latin America for a period of time after the war is the continuation of certain aspects of the Nazi Bell project.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
So in other words, what they need all this money for is to fund and finance very advanced black projects research, which they are pursuing independently of any of the post-war victorious Allied powers, and that would include the Soviet Union. What they're attempting to do is, I think, set up a source of permanent funding for their black projects, for their black operations, all of this stuff, for their international terrorism efforts. This is the other big thing that we need to bear in mind about this post-war group of Nazis that I talk about in Babylon's Banksters and Nazi International, because these are the people that had the funding, the intelligence organization, and the actual organization itself to carry out these activities after the war. If you scratch and sniff long enough, you're ultimately going to find yourself dealing with people like Otto Skorzeny in nationalist Spain. And again, it is this organization that sponsored and hosted many of those international terrorist summits in the 60s and 70s. In other words, these things were being hosted by Nazis.
Yeah.
So look further, my friends, than just radical Muslims for these activities, because there's another player involved with them at a much deeper level. And it, again, goes back to this post-war Nazi International. See,
I for some reason also have, or I can turn around and say and ask you this as a question: are you of the belief, that some of the world wars were financed in such a way in order to actually destroy German, science? They have, the engineering. They had, huge advances in terms of what they were onto in terms of their physics, theoretical science, other aspects as well. Because this goes back to what you alluded to earlier in the interview, when you mentioned that this group of banksters are also interested in basically keeping certain technologies, off the market, so to speak, known to other people. And from your point of view, obviously, that the Nazis were involved in some interesting experimentation and science projects, which are potentially just leading to some of these aspects. So how do you connect these two different ideas? That on one hand, they're building up something, which is, exotic technology in one hand. At the same time, they seem to try to destroy the German scientific progress that were happening around the time of the world wars as well. How do you piece this together, Joseph?
Oh boy, what an excellent question! And I have not intentionally addressed that question in any of my books, but it does fall out as an implication, particularly from books like Philosopher's Stone and Babylon's Banksters, Nazi International, and Roswell and the Reich, I would add into that mix. To speculate a bit here, off the top of my head, in answer to your question, there has been a group of thought, a school of thought, largely that falls out of the research of Anthony Sutton, the fellow that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, that World War II was essentially, or rather, I should say, the Nazi regime was kind of an experiment that was being run by these bankers as to which form of socialism should we pursue. Do we pursue the international socialism of communism in Soviet Russia? Do we pursue the National Socialist version of it in Nazi Germany? Or do we pursue the kind of mild, moderate New Deal socialism of Franklin Roosevelt in the United States of America? And as a result of Hitler's just nothing less than stunning military success by June of 1940, with the fall of France. Well, my word, by this point, you have the Nazis basically in control of the industrial regions of France, certainly in control of the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Western Poland. And then by the end of May of 1941, they're in control of significant portions of Yugoslavia and Greece. They have Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland as allies. So in other words, basically, by May of 1941, you've got all of Europe under the German jackboot.
That's right.
And the situation for the banksters at that point is they've created a monster, and this man isn't even playing by by their own financial rules either.
Right.
He's funding this vast German war machine basically on debt-free money. So there's just no way you're going to control this thing. You have to get rid of it.
Yeah.
You must put down. You absolutely must put down Germany as a nation. Now, the real interesting aspect of your question is that you're insinuating that the real goal of World War II is to maintain a lock on the technology that clearly is beginning to be implied by the physics papers that were being published in Germany between the wars.
Yes.
And that is clearly, the Allies knew that there was something afoot inside of Nazi Germany along those lines, but they didn't know exactly what, and they figured that, well, probably they're going after the A-bomb, which they did, and which, in my opinion, they actually got.
That's right. That's right. But they wanted to go further even.
Oh yes, much, much, much further.
Yeah.
We need only look at the fact that the Bell Project was called Kriegsentscheidend, war decisive. Well, that's the only thing in Nazi Germany that ever merited that description. The atom bomb itself did not even do that. So in other words, the Nazis are pursuing so-called free energy with this device. They're pursuing field propulsion with this device. They're pursuing if you weaponize this kind of physics, my word, you've made a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Yeah, that's right.
so you've got a lock on the ultimate planet-busting doomsday weapon if you want to weaponize this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think you do have to entertain the possibility, to finally answer your question, that you do have to entertain the possibility that part of the goal of this war is to get a lock on whatever it is the Nazis are developing. And, as I pointed out in Nazi International, if you look closely at the division of the spoils and who is doing it, it's the Nazis themselves driving who gets what. They make very sure, Henrik, that the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc get roughly an equal division of the spoils precisely in order to create a post-war stalemate and deadlock. And on top of this, you turn over that whole Nazi military intelligence unit, Femte Heere Ost, under General Gehlen, that was active inside of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the war. Well, you turn that over lock, stock, and barrel to the United States, and that ultimately becomes the Soviet operational desk of the CIA. So in other words, by the time the CIA is created in 1947, you have nothing but a house of Nazi spies under the front of the CIA, and here's the bad news, folks.
If that wasn't bad enough.
But the day-to-day operational control of that organization remains in the hands of the very same German general that ran it during World War II.
Crazy.
So, and to me, this is the only explanation you need for the 1948 panic in the United States. Oh my word, the Soviets are about ready to overrun Western Europe at any moment, because the military assessment of Soviet capabilities and intentions came from where? It came from General Gehlen's network.
Yeah.
So in other words, I think, Henrik, you had the Nazis not only driving a technological stalemate after the war, but you had them further increasing the East-West tension by dint of these intelligence analyses and estimates that they're probably feeding to both sides.
That's interesting.
And why is that necessary? Well, you need only study the history of German diplomacy since the era of Frederick the Great. They are constantly, just because of their geopolitical position, they are constantly having to play off East against West to give Germany maneuvering room in the middle. And that's precisely what happened after World War II. And as I point out in the Nazi International, when the Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, that's the anniversary not only of Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany, but that's also the anniversary of the beer hall putsch in 1923.
Right.
So, this didn't come down by accident. It happened on significant Nazi anniversaries. It was a coordinated activity. Mm. And if you look at the moves then of the German government under Chancellor Kohl at the time, Germany moved quickly and almost unilaterally.